June 19th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The morning sun strikes the water like sheets of burning glass. Far below, the carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy turn east, their decks lined with men who have not yet realized they are flying into extinction. Engines cough to life. The deep growl of the Mitsubishi A6M Zeros rises over the Pacific wind. Pilots tighten their harnesses, whisper quiet prayers, and lift into the blinding light. They have done this 100 times before. But today, something feels different. High above the horizon, blue specks appear, silent at first, then growing, swelling into dark silhouettes. They are not Zeros. They are bigger, heavier, faster. Their wings glint with U.S. insignia. The new American fighter, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, prowls the sky like a steel predator. In moments, the world turns into streaks of fire and smoke. Machine guns thunder. The thin-skinned Zeros shatter under the Hellcat's heavy armor and 6.50 caliber guns. For the first time, Japanese pilots understand what no amount of bravery can change. The sky now belongs to someone else. And it began with the arrival of the Hellcat. The Pacific War began as a storm no one could stop. When Japanese carrier planes struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the world saw an empire rise on wings of precision and daring. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero became the symbol of that dominance, a sleek, light, and devastatingly agile fighter that outflew everything the Allies could send against it. In those first months, the Zero was untouchable. Over the Philippines, American P-40s and P-39s were torn from the sky. At Wake Island and the Dutch East Indies, outnumbered defenders faced pilots trained in years of combat over China. Even in the early carrier clashes, Coral Sea, Midway, the Zero ruled the air in one-on-one combat. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and range farther than any opponent. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its doctrine on that aircraft and on the men who flew it. Pilots of the Tainan Air Group, like Saburo Sakai, came from a warrior tradition stretching back to the samurai. They flew with discipline and individual skill, molded by years of rigorous training and combat experience. The Zero, light and unarmored, reflected their philosophy: to strike first, strike cleanly, and never be hit. Against this, the U.S. Navy fought a desperate learning battle. Its frontline fighter, the Grumman F4F Wildcat, was sturdy but sluggish. In the hands of inexperienced American pilots, it seemed hopelessly outclassed. Yet, in the crucible of defeat, new ideas emerged. Commander John S. Jimmy Thach developed a tactic that would become legend, the Thach Weave, a maneuver allowing two Wildcats to cover each other and turn a Zero's advantage against it. Every battle became a classroom, every loss a note written in blood. By 1942, the Americans understood that survival depended not on outmaneuvering the Zero, but outthinking it. Still, Japan's confidence soared. Victories across the Pacific fed an illusion of invincibility. The empire expanded from Burma to the Solomons. Its naval aviators, the best trained in the world, believed the Zero could hold the sky forever. But unseen beneath that brilliance, cracks began to show. The same lightweight design that gave the Zero its agility also made it fragile. A single burst from a .50 caliber gun could tear it apart. Its lack of armor left pilots exposed, and its non-self-sealing fuel tanks turned every hit into a fireball. Japan's aircraft industry, though skilled, could not easily innovate or mass-produce replacements. Meanwhile, across the ocean, another force was awakening. In the factories of Bethpage, New York, and across the American heartland, the machinery of total war began to move. Engineers studied wrecked Zeros recovered in the Aleutians and China. They saw the strengths and the fatal weaknesses of Japan's design. The U.S. didn't just need a new fighter, it needed a solution. Something that could climb faster, dive harder, and take punishment without breaking apart. As 1943 dawned, the Pacific Air War entered a new phase. The once dominant Japanese carriers now faced growing losses at Guadalcanal. Their veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training programs, once years long, were cut to months. And in that same year, in the hangars of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a team of American engineers led by Leroy Grumman and Ironworks men began shaping a fighter that would end the Zero's reign. It would look heavy, it would sound brutal, and it would change the balance of the Pacific forever. From these industrial shadows, the F6F Hellcat was born, the machine that would turn the hunter into the hunted. And as the war pressed toward the heart of the Pacific, the first Hellcats began to arrive on carrier decks, waiting for the day they would meet the Zero in open sky.
The year was 1942. At Grumman's Long Island plant, the sound of rivet guns echoed day and night. Mechanics worked under floodlights, surrounded by half-built fuselages and the sharp scent of machine oil. The orders from the Navy were clear: build a fighter that could beat the Zero at its own game, but survive where others could not. The design team, led by Leroy Grumman, Bill Schwendler, and Jake Swerble, called themselves the Iron Works. They were practical men, engineers who believed in strength and simplicity. Their new aircraft, the F6F Hellcat, would embody that philosophy. It would not be elegant like the Zero. It would be powerful, reliable, and built to bring its pilot home. The Hellcat began as an evolution of the Wildcat, but the transformation quickly became radical. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, almost twice that of the Zero. With its massive engine cowling and broad wings, the Hellcat was no lightweight dancer. It was a brawler. Grumman's engineers had studied the wrecked Zero recovered in the Aleutians and learned its secrets. They understood how Japan had achieved lightness: thin metal, no armor, minimal redundancy. The Americans went the other way. The Hellcat's cockpit was wrapped in armor plate. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing. The landing gear was wide and sturdy, designed for brutal carrier landings. Every part of it said one thing: survival. But raw power alone meant little without the right philosophy of use. The U.S. Navy had also been evolving in tactics, training, and doctrine. By 1943, the Naval Air Training Command had become a massive pilot factory. Young men passed through Pensacola and Corpus Christi, trained not for duels, but for teamwork, discipline, and carrier coordination. The days of individual dogfighting were ending. The era of integrated air warfare was beginning. When the Hellcat took its first flight on June 26, 1942, test pilot Robert Hall felt something extraordinary. The aircraft was stable, forgiving, and powerful. It climbed like a rocket and dove with authority. It could take a hit and keep flying. It was not graceful, but it was lethal. Production moved fast. Grumman's Ironworks reputation was well earned, and the factory turned out Hellcats at a rate that stunned even Navy planners. Each machine rolled off the line, ready to be bolted to a carrier deck and shipped to the front. By mid-1943, the first squadrons, VF-9 and VF-5, began operations aboard USS Essex and USS Yorktown. Their mission? Meet the Zero and destroy it. At first, pilots were skeptical. The Hellcat was larger, heavier, and seemingly slower to turn. But combat quickly erased doubt. It could outdive, outclimb, and out-accelerate anything the Japanese fielded. A Zero might turn tighter for a moment, but the Hellcat could roll into a dive and leave it spinning helplessly. Above all, it could take punishment. Where a Zero burst into flame after a few hits, Hellcats came back to their carriers riddled with holes, but alive. The pilots began to call it their Iron Cat. As 1943 turned to 1944, the skies over the Solomons and Central Pacific filled with this new predator. Squadron by squadron, the F6F replaced the older Wildcats. American carriers now launched waves of these blue-painted beasts, each one carrying 650 caliber Browning machine guns, capable of tearing through aircraft and bombers alike. On the Japanese side, the change was terrifying. Pilots returning from missions spoke of an American fighter that climbed like a rocket and could not be shaken. For the first time, the Imperial Navy's elite began to doubt the machine that had carried them to glory. The stage was set. Two philosophies of air war, one built on agility and tradition, the other on power and endurance, were about to collide over the vastness of the Pacific. And when they did, the world would see which future belonged to the sky.
1. The human angle. Experience versus youth. By the time the Hellcat entered combat in 1943, the Pacific skies had become a graveyard for Japan's finest. The veterans who had once swept across the Pacific were now gone, buried at Midway, Guadalcanal, or the Coral Sea. In their place came young men, barely trained, hurried through flight schools that had once demanded years of perfection. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot training system had been its pride, only a few hundred men selected from thousands. But as losses mounted, quality gave way to quantity. Training was reduced from 700 flight hours to less than 100. Many cadets had never fired a real machine gun before combat. Across the ocean, America was doing the opposite. Its training program had become an industrial machine, producing not only pilots, but a mindset. Men like David McCampbell, Butch O'Hare, and Alex Vracu came from universities, farms, and towns. Ordinary men molded into disciplined professionals. They were younger, but their training was relentless. Simulators, formation drills, and live fire exercises ensured that by the time they reached the front, they were ready for anything. The Hellcat became their equalizer, a plane that could forgive mistakes and turn learning into victory. When these men took to the skies over the Pacific, the contrast was stark. On one side, a dwindling corps of once elite samurai. On the other, a tide of confident, well-trained newcomers who could afford to fight again tomorrow. The human balance had shifted, not by courage, but by endurance. 2. The technological angle, muscle versus grace. The F6F Hellcat and the A6M Zero represented two opposite answers to the same question. How do you win a dogfight? The Zero's creators, led by Jiro Horikoshi, believed in purity of flight. Every gram of metal was calculated. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, only performance. The result was astonishing agility and range. It could climb on minimal power, cruise for hours, and turn inside any Allied plane. But the Hellcat didn't play by those rules. It was built to dominate. Powered by the R-2800 Double Wasp, it could reach speeds over 370 miles per hour, almost 60 miles per hour faster than the Zero. Its dive speed exceeded 500 miles per hour, a range the Japanese airframes couldn't safely match. It carried 6.5 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 400 rounds per gun, capable of shredding bombers and fighters alike. Even more crucial was its protection. Armor plates shielded the cockpit, bullet-resistant glass guarded the pilot's head, and self-sealing fuel tanks drastically reduced fire risk. A Hellcat could absorb hits that would have torn a Zero apart and still bring its pilot home. The two aircraft were symbols of their nations. The Zero embodied the individual mastery of flight, delicate, precise, and brave. The Hellcat reflected American industry, heavy, reliable, and pragmatic. One fought with finesse, the other with power. And when the two finally met in open combat, technology decided what courage could not. 3. The tactical angle, the evolution of the hunt. By 1943, air combat in the Pacific had changed forever. The early days of swirling dogfights with pilots chasing each other in tight circles were gone. The Americans had learned that agility meant nothing without tactics. The Thach Weave, first developed in 1942, became doctrine. Two Hellcats flew in parallel, weaving across each other's paths. If a Zero tailed one, it exposed itself to the guns of the other. It was teamwork at its deadliest, the opposite of the Japanese method of solo combat. Hellcat squadrons also began using altitude and radar coordination. U.S. carriers used fighter direction officers, guided by ship-based radar, to position squadrons above the enemy. When Japanese formations appeared, the Hellcats were already waiting, with the sun at their backs. Japan had no such system. Their planes launched into the unknown, often without radar guidance or coordinated vectors. Once they reached their targets, fuel was already running low. American pilots learned to climb, dive, and strike from advantage, never turning, never playing the Zero's game. Engagements became ambushes, not duels. The Pacific sky turned into a vast chessboard, and the Hellcat was the new queen of the board. In the tactical sense, it was no longer about bravery. It was about control, of altitude, of speed, of energy. And with every encounter, the Hellcat proved that in modern war, discipline beat instinct. By 1944, the results were clear. The men, the machines, and the methods had all changed. America was now dictating the terms of battle. Japan, once the hunter, had become the hunted.
4. The psychological angle, the shattering of belief. For the Japanese pilot of 1944, the cockpit had once been sacred ground, a space where mastery and spirit could defy impossible odds. But the arrival of the Hellcat changed something deeper than the air war. It shattered belief. In the early years of the war, Japanese aviators had carried an unshakable confidence, born from years of triumph. They believed the Zero was invincible, and that their own discipline and courage were beyond question. Yet, as the Hellcat swept through formation after formation, this belief eroded. Reports from returning pilots were grim. They described enemies who climbed faster, dived harder, and refused to fall. Dogfights that once ended in quick kills turned into chaotic, one-sided slaughters. Young flyers returned shaken, if they returned at all. In squadron ready rooms from Truk to Saipan, morale began to fracture. Veterans could see the end coming. They spoke quietly about it, their words careful, respectful, but the meaning clear. We cannot stop them. On the American side, confidence soared, but it was not arrogance. Hellcat pilots spoke often of luck, teamwork, and their aircraft's strength. They knew the statistics, that the Hellcat kill ratio was climbing with each month, but they also knew that one mistake could still mean death. The respect for their opponent remained, even as the outcome became certain. Psychologically, the air war was no longer balanced. Japan's pilots fought for honor. America's pilots fought for survival and victory. One fought from memory, the other from momentum. And in war, momentum is everything. 5. The industrial angle, the machine behind the pilot. The Pacific War was not only fought in the sky, it was forged in the factories. Behind every Hellcat stood an army of workers, engineers, and assembly lines that never slept. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States produced over 12,000 Hellcats. Each one was tested, crated, shipped, and assembled aboard carriers that spanned half the Pacific. Replacement parts, fuel, and ammunition flowed endlessly from a continent untouched by war. Grumman's factory in Bethpage became a symbol of this industrial might. They called it the Iron Works for a reason, because no matter how many were needed, the answer was always yes. The plant operated around the clock, its workers often saying they could feel the war in the noise of the machines. Japan, by contrast, was breaking. Bombing raids crippled its aircraft production. Aluminum and steel were scarce. Engines were hand-assembled by workers with limited experience. Even when new aircraft designs appeared, like the improved A6M5 or the N1K Shiden, they arrived too late, too few, and with untrained pilots to fly them. For every Zero Japan built in 1944, America built 10 Hellcats. For every pilot Japan lost, America trained 5 more. The industrial war was over long before the last dogfight, but the men in the sky still had to live through its consequences. The Hellcat wasn't just an aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of American industry, the answer to years of loss forged in aluminum and courage. 6. The moral angle, the cost of superiority. Technological triumph always carries a shadow. The Hellcat's dominance came with a terrible arithmetic. The air battles of 1944 were not balanced contests, they were exterminations. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, entire Japanese squadrons vanished before ever reaching their targets. Pilots in Zeros, barely trained and often underarmed, flew straight into formations of radar-guided Hellcats and flak. Few came back. There was no glory left in these fights, only inevitability. American pilots, though victorious, often spoke of unease. Some described the ease of shooting down opponents who could not fight back as haunting. Others compared it to hunting, not combat. Many later admitted they felt no joy in these victories. The moral weight of total air dominance was heavy. Technology had turned the sky from a place of courage into a machine of destruction. Japan's pilots, for their part, continued to fly with unwavering duty. Even when their leaders knew the war was lost, they kept sending young men into the air. Honor demanded it. Survival no longer mattered. When the Hellcat met the Zero, it was not simply a contest of airplanes. It was a confrontation between eras. One still believed in the heroism of the individual. The other had embraced the machinery of total war. In that contrast lay the tragedy of the Pacific Air War, not just in who won, but in how victory was achieved. By mid-1944, the contrast had reached its breaking point. The Japanese Navy, desperate and cornered, launched its final, massive carrier air offensive, a gamble to retake the initiative and strike at the American fleet advancing toward the Marianas. It was meant to be a decisive battle. Instead, it became the day Japanese pilots met the Hellcat and understood the war was already lost.
June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The dawn was clear, the horizon endless. Below, the Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance, moved eastward. 15 carriers, 7 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft forming a floating fortress of steel. The objective was Saipan, the gateway to Japan's defensive perimeter. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it was the last chance to turn the tide. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the newly formed First Mobile Fleet, 9 carriers, 500 aircraft, and the remaining fragments of Japan's once invincible air arm. Their plan, strike first,
annihilate the American carriers, and restore the balance of the Pacific. But the reality was far different. The Japanese launched their first wave shortly after 10 a.m. From Guam and the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Taiho, more than 300 aircraft rose into the pale morning sky. Many of the pilots were young, barely trained, flying aircraft that were lighter and slower than their enemies. Some had never seen combat. Few had ever landed on a carrier before. High above the fleet, radar operators aboard the USS Lexington detected them at 150 miles out, long before any Japanese eye could see the American ships. Fighter direction officers began vectoring dozens of Hellcats to intercept. They climbed fast, their blue silhouettes rising into the stratosphere like predatory birds. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, leading VF-15, later recalled the voice over the radio. "Hellcats, bogies bearing 320, Angels 15, this is the big one." Moments later, the Pacific sky erupted. The first wave of Zeros and Judies broke through scattered clouds and met a storm of .5 caliber fire. Hellcats dove from above, wings flashing, guns spitting tracers that carved through aluminum. The radar coordination allowed American squadrons to attack from perfect position, sun behind them, altitude above them. What the Japanese had expected to be a surprise assault became a slaughter. Within minutes, entire formations disintegrated. The Zeros, still agile, tried to turn inside the heavier Hellcats, but every maneuver ended in disaster. The American planes simply climbed, rolled, and struck again. Radio chatter filled with calm voices, splash 1, splash 2, as Hellcats cut through the sky. By noon, nearly 200 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. Only a handful reached the U.S. fleet, and fewer still managed to drop their bombs. Anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol Hellcats tore them apart before they could line up attacks. Far to the west, aboard the carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa still believed success was possible. His flagship, Japan's newest carrier, seemed invincible, but fate intervened. An American submarine, USS Albacore, slipped through the screen and launched 6 torpedoes. One struck Taiho amidships. Fumes from the fuel system ignited hours later, engulfing the carrier in flames. Ozawa barely escaped. At nearly the same time, another submarine, USS Kavala, found Shokaku, one of the veterans of Pearl Harbor, and sent her to the bottom. Above the sea, the Hellcats continued their grim work. The afternoon brought 2 more waves of Japanese aircraft, each smaller, each less coordinated. Radar picked them up, and American fighters intercepted long before they could approach the fleet. By late afternoon, the carrier's decks were littered with empty fuel tanks of returning Hellcats, many punctured but alive. That night, as the last aircraft landed, pilots and deck crews stood among the scattered shell casings and oil stains, realizing what had just happened. They had faced the entire remaining strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy and destroyed it in a single day. By sunset, the Japanese had lost nearly 300 aircraft. Another 100 were gone the next day. The Americans had lost just over 30 Hellcats. It was the end of Japan's naval aviation as a fighting force, though neither side yet knew how final the defeat would be. The Japanese called it the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American pilots would remember it by another name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And for the Japanese airmen who survived, it was the moment they realized the empire could no longer control the sky. But the destruction was not yet complete. What came next would erase any remaining illusion that Japan could ever recover its air power.
The next morning, June 20, 1944, the sea was quiet again, deceptively calm. Smoke still drifted across the horizon from burning wrecks, remnants of Japan's shattered air wings. Yet far to the west, Admiral Ozawa's surviving carriers were still retreating, trying to regroup, still believing they could fight another day. Admiral Mark Mitcher aboard the USS Lexington saw the opportunity. He ordered a final strike, one of the longest-range carrier attacks in history. At 4:30 p.m., nearly 240 aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers roared off the decks of the U.S. fleet and vanished into the setting sun. They had just enough fuel to reach the enemy, strike, and maybe return. For the pilots, it was a mission of pure resolve. Every gallon of fuel, every mile of airspace was measured against the fading light. The orders were simple. Find Ozawa's fleet and finish the job. They found it just before dusk. Through the golden haze of the late afternoon sky, the Japanese formation appeared. The carriers Zuikaku, Hiyo, Junyo, and a scattering of escort ships. Hellcats dove first, clearing the air of what little opposition remained. The Zeros that rose to meet them were slow, scattered, and uncoordinated, many flown by half-trained replacements. One Hellcat pilot, Ensign George C. Duncan, later described the moment. "They came at us head-on, but there was no fight left in them. We turned once, fired, and they were gone. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was execution." Then came the bombers. Curtiss Helldivers rolled into their dives from 10,000 feet, releasing 1,000-pound bombs onto the fleeing carriers. Grumman Avengers followed with torpedoes, their slow, deliberate approaches shielded by the circling Hellcats above. At 7 p.m., a torpedo struck the carrier Hiyo amidships. Flames engulfed the deck. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar as fuel lines burst. Within an hour, she was gone, another pillar of the Imperial Navy swallowed by fire and sea. The other carriers staggered on, crippled and burning. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor strike force, limped westward, her decks scarred, her aircraft gone. As night fell, the American strike groups turned for home. They were deep over enemy waters, low on fuel, and surrounded by darkness. The return flight became its own battle, against distance, exhaustion, and time. When the first Hellcats reached the fleet hours later, their fuel gauges read 0. Admiral Mitcher gave the order, rarely spoken in naval history. "Turn on the lights." Every carrier in the task force switched on its deck lights and search beams, risking detection to guide their men home. Pilots followed the glow like moths to flame, landing in the dark, sometimes 2 or 3 to a deck. Dozens ditched in the sea, but most survived. The day ended not just with victory, but with something more profound. A realization that the Pacific War had entered a new age. Japan had launched nearly 450 aircraft. Fewer than 130 made it back. Of those, many were damaged beyond repair. The U.S. Navy's total losses, 123 aircraft, most from running out of fuel, not enemy action. In 2 days, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective carrier force. Its elite airmen were dead, its remaining planes obsolete, its training program in ruins. Post-war Japanese officers would later describe the moment with quiet finality. From that day, our fate in the air was sealed. For the Americans, the numbers were almost unbelievable. The Hellcat alone accounted for the vast majority of Japanese losses, confirming what test pilots and tacticians already knew. The F6F had become the perfect weapon, rugged, fast, mercilessly efficient. The statistics would echo through history. Hellcat kill ratio, 19-1. No other fighter in the war would come close, and for every Hellcat that returned with bullet holes or oil leaks, there was a young pilot alive inside, a testament to armor, engineering, and the power of preparation. When the sun rose on June 21, 1944, the Pacific sky was empty of Japanese planes. The once dominant empire that had launched the war from the air was now blind, grounded, and broken. The sky, once the domain of the Zero, now belonged entirely to the Hellcat. In the weeks that followed, the Americans pressed forward to Saipan, Tinian, and Guam under a canopy of blue-painted guardians. Japan's remaining airmen fought bravely, but the truth was undeniable. The era of the Zero was over. And from that moment on, the war was no longer about if Japan would lose, only when.
The silence that followed the Battle of the Philippine Sea was almost unreal. For 3 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ruled the Pacific with confidence born of skill and tradition. Now, its flight decks were empty, its hangars hollow, its airfields scattered with the wreckage of burned-out aircraft. The numbers told a truth even propaganda could not disguise. Japan lost over 645 aircraft in 2 days, nearly its entire carrier air arm. Hundreds of experienced aviators, men who had survived Coral Sea and Midway, were gone. The newer pilots, many in their teens, had lasted only minutes in combat. The U.S. Navy lost 123 planes, mostly from fuel exhaustion during the night landings, and only a handful of pilots to enemy fire. This imbalance marked a transformation more profound than any single battle. It was the end of Japanese naval aviation as a strategic weapon. When Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sent his final report to Tokyo, it was written in the language of quiet resignation. He did not claim victory or even resistance. His fleet had been broken not by luck or surprise, but by the complete superiority of an enemy that could outproduce, outfly, and outlast him. The carrier Zuikaku, the last of the Pearl Harbor strike force, limped back to port in Japan with barely 24 aircraft aboard. She would never launch a full air group again. For Japan, the blow was not only military, it was spiritual. The myth of the invincible pilot, the ideal of the samurai aviator, had been erased in the span of 48 hours. Commanders who had once preached the supremacy of spirit over material now faced a reality that spirit could not change. The Japanese Navy tried to rebuild its air arm, but it was like trying to replace a heart with fragments. Pilots were trained in weeks, not years. Fuel shortages crippled flying hours. Aluminum was replaced by wood in some designs. New aircraft like the A6M8 and N1K Shiden Kai showed promise, but there were no skilled hands left to use them effectively. Meanwhile, America's machine roared forward. In the months following the battle, Hellcat production surged. Carrier groups rotated fresh aircraft and pilots through the Pacific faster than the enemy could react. The lessons of the battle were codified into doctrine: radar coordination, altitude advantage, energy fighting, teamwork. Every future operation, from the Marianas to Leyte Gulf, would follow this blueprint. The carrier task force had become the ultimate weapon of the 20th century. In Japan's skies, the contrast was heartbreaking. Airfields once filled with proud Zero squadrons now stood empty or guarded by inexperienced cadets. On distant islands, surviving pilots spoke in hushed tones about that battle, about the blue fighters that came out of the sun faster than they could climb, stronger than they could shoot down. The realization spread quietly through the ranks. The Pacific skies no longer belonged to them. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had seized Saipan, Guam, and Tinian. The Marianas were now home to airfields from which B-29 superfortresses would launch the strategic bombing of Japan itself. The loss of the sea had become the loss of the homeland. It all traced back to that moment in June, when the Hellcat met the Zero and ended an era. The Empire's wings had been clipped. Its dream of domination had burned away over the Philippine Sea. But the echoes of that defeat would continue, reshaping not just the war, but the future of aerial warfare itself.
In the aftermath of the Philippine Sea, the Pacific's endless horizon became a silent witness to what had been lost. For Japan, the skies that once symbolized courage and freedom had turned into a graveyard of ambition. In Tokyo, Naval Command convened emergency meetings to assess the scale of the disaster. The reports were devastating. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots gone, aircraft production crippled, carrier strength reduced to shells. Even the most loyal officers struggled to find hope. Admiral Somu Toyota, who had inherited the command, read the battle analysis in silence before uttering the unspoken truth. We no longer possess the means to contest the air. Across the ocean, American pilots were coming to terms with victory. In the ready rooms of the USS Essex, Yorktown, and Lexington, men traded quiet glances rather than cheers. The triumph was overwhelming, but it carried a strange emptiness. They had fought an enemy who had once ruled the Pacific and destroyed him in 2 days. Lieutenant Alex Rassiu, who downed 6 Japanese aircraft in a single mission that day, later reflected, "They came on brave, but helpless. It wasn't a fair fight anymore." That sentence, "It wasn't a fair fight," became the unspoken truth of the Pacific Air War's final phase. The Hellcat superiority was now absolute. Between 1943 and 1945, F6F pilots claimed 5,156 aerial victories across the Pacific. Its kill ratio of 19-1 was unmatched by any fighter of the Second World War. It became the shield of every American carrier and the sword of every offensive. Yet for all its triumph, the Hellcat was more than a machine of war. It represented an evolution in thought, a recognition that wars were no longer won by the individual ace, but by the system that produced him. Training, logistics, radar, and production mattered as much as courage. This understanding defined modern air warfare. Japan, however, clung to an older code. Even as defeat became certain, the nation's leaders turned towards sacrifice as the final expression of loyalty. The same skies once filled with Zeros now saw the rise of the kamikaze, pilots sent to die because there were no tools left with which to win. The contrast was tragic. The Hellcat pilot flew to survive and fight again. The Japanese pilot flew to die because survival had become meaningless. Every encounter after 1944 reflected that shift. Battles no longer of equals, but of desperation against inevitability. Post-war testimonies from surviving Japanese aviators often spoke not of hatred, but of awe. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, survived the war and later said, "The Hellcat was perfect. It could outclimb, outdive, and outshoot us. But more than that, it never stopped coming." That persistence, born not from fanaticism, but from organization and will, became the lasting legacy of the American war machine. For Grumman's engineers back in New York, news of the Hellcat's success brought quiet pride. Many of them had never left the factory floor, yet their hands had shaped the aircraft that changed the Pacific. Workers called the factory the Iron Works, but by war's end they began calling it something else, the place that brought them home. The F6F Hellcat served in every major Pacific operation until the final surrender in 1945. It destroyed Japan's air arm, cleared the skies for the B-29s that would bomb the home islands, and guarded the carriers that brought the war to Tokyo Bay. When Japan finally surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, the sky above was filled with Hellcats flying in formation, a silent symbol of victory and of the price paid to achieve it. The Pacific had been conquered not by myth or valor alone, but by the relentless precision of technology and the men who mastered it. The war in the air was over, but its lessons would echo far beyond the wreckage left behind. In the long memory of war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea stands not just as a victory, but as a turning point, the day the balance of the Pacific shifted forever. When Japanese pilots met the Hellcat, they were not only meeting a superior machine, they were confronting the future. For 3 years, Japan had believed that courage and training could overcome material disadvantage, that willpower could defeat industry.
The Hellcat shattered that illusion. It was the embodiment of a new kind of warfare where success was built on discipline, technology, and an unbreakable chain of production. Every rivet driven into its steel frame was a statement of endurance. Every pilot who returned from battle alive represented a victory of systems over chance, of preparation over desperation. The F6F did not win because it was beautiful, or elegant, or fast beyond compare. It won because it worked, because it brought its pilot home, because it gave the United States something Japan had already lost, the ability to learn, adapt, and sustain. For Japan, the meeting between Zero and Hellcat marked the end of a philosophy, the twilight of the warrior ideal. The skies that once celebrated the lone ace now belonged to the fleet, the radar operator, the engineer, and the mechanic. The age of the individual hero was giving way to the age of the system. Yet within that transformation lies the deepest human truth of all wars, that bravery alone is never enough, but without it, nothing else matters. The Japanese pilots who faced the Hellcat fought with extraordinary courage. The American pilots who flew it carried that courage forward, shaped by training, guided by reason, supported by thousands they would never meet. Together they defined the modern battlefield, one ruled by machines, but still driven by men. When historians look back at that sky over the Philippine Sea, they see more than smoke and wreckage. They see a moment when the world understood what industrial warfare truly meant and how the future would be fought. The Hellcat's roar faded decades ago, but its legacy still echoes, a reminder that mastery of the air is not won by myth, but by mastery itself. The day Japanese pilots met the Hellcat, they understood not just why they could not win the Pacific, but why the world itself was changing.